We can start, and people will come in. Yeah, okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for being connected today. The Friendship is pleased to invite you to this investor briefing on the financial risks and ESG issues of chemicals. So this subject is really important because perfluorinated compounds, which are called PFAS, are found in our everyday products, such as clothing, consumer electronics, packaging, and many others. They're called eternal pollutants, and they have an irreversible impact on both health and the environment. So we are all wondering which chemicals companies are making progress in reducing their footprint, which are lagging behind, how investors can engage with chemicals players in 2003 and beyond. And so today we're pleased and we are lucky to have Rachel Crossley, who is head of stewardship Europe at BNP Paribas AM, and Sonja Heder, who is senior business and investors advisor at ChemSec. So please feel free to ask any questions on the chat, and then the speakers will answer them in the second half of the webinar. So I'll let the floor to Rachel. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Would you like me to share the slides, or are you going to do that? Okay.
Yeah, you can do it.
Okay. I think I have the problem that when I'm sharing slides, I can't necessarily see questions come in, but I think you said we'll address those more towards the end.
No problem.
Yes. So can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, okay. Sorry, they weren't moving. Right, yes. So great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about what we consider the real imperative to transition to safe and sustainable chemistry. Just going to give you a background as to how we work and why we focus heavily on this sector and all of the risks associated with it. We, in our stewardship team, focus very much on systemic risks, addressing systemic risks. Clearly, we cannot build a sustainable economy if we don't have sustainable investment. And so we are committed to using our stewardship to engage with both corporates and sovereigns, to be very active, proactive in our voting, and also to do aligned public policy engagement to try to shape the future. We call ourselves future makers. We want to play a very active role in building that sustainable future. As a very large, broadly diversified investor, that means that we invest in many companies and sectors across both developed and emerging economies. And so we face systemic risks, and that is those risks that are generated by one or more sector and then impose long-term impacts and costs on other sectors, and also the wider economy and society. And so that means that these kinds of risks need to be addressed using strategic joined-up solutions. And for us, the chemical sector is one of these sectors. It generates these interlinked long-term global impacts and risks. So just to flesh that out a little bit more, as Justine just alluded to, synthetic chemicals are already integral to modern life. They're found in around 95% of all manufactured products. Now it's being very well sort of promoted that we can't solve many sustainability challenges and the climate crisis without synthetic chemicals in things like solar panels or electric vehicle batteries and other technologies. However, we need those chemicals to be both safe and sustainable. We base a lot of our work on the planetary boundary research, which I hope you're all familiar with, produced by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Recently, they have confirmed that we've now crossed 6 of the 9 key planetary boundaries. So those sort of boundaries that really create the safe operating space for the planet and people. You can see the graphic on the right, we are, as we know, well beyond and heading to be well beyond the safe operating limits for climate, also for biodiversity. So that's the biosphere integrity. And then the biogeochemical flows, so the phosphorus and nitrogen at the bottom there, already usage is well below the sort of carrying capacity of the Earth. And then the top sort of right segment, novel entities, within that segment that you can see is predicted to be the one that's most beyond the safe operating boundary. That includes chemicals. So this sector is one of those sectors that combines its impacts across all of those different segments. So we have around 6 to 7% of global emissions emanate, climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions emanate from this sector. There's extensive, well-documented science showing the impacts of chemicals on nature and biodiversity in terms of insects, pollinators, fish and birds. And then pollution in water, soils, etc. And then we've got huge impacts on human health, both in terms of occupational impacts for workers, but also wider than that for all of us who are consumers. Many of these toxic chemicals have been linked to birth defects, many types of cancer, to increase risk of obesity, attention deficit type disorders, and other illnesses. And I don't know whether Sonia might have been going to mention this, but yesterday, I don't know if you saw the press around the fact that EU parliamentarians had been tested for PFAS, as have, in fact, ChemSec staff. And, everyone, we all have this in our blood now, all of these PFAS and these very damaging chemicals. So I think it's a very good exercise to do to really bring it home to people how exposed we are. So given, you can imagine then that these impacts generate huge costs for governments and wider society. There are cleanup costs, there are healthcare costs, there's the regulatory and environmental protection costs. And so that feeds into regulatory risks, litigation, market risks that all add up to financial risks for us. So we hope that demonstrates that there's this huge need to move towards safe and sustainable chemistry, and that's the agenda that we're working on with this sector. And I skipped over, sorry, the bullet point there, that in the EU, of about 300 million tons of chemicals that were produced in 2017, 75% are considered hazardous to human health and 28% hazardous to the environment. So we're, the scale is clear there. Just speaking a little bit more about the costs. So there's lots of different studies out there with lots of different scopes focusing on different types of chemical or different geographies, etc., and calculating these impacts in different ways. But that first bullet there was a calculation from about 2016 showing that the costs associated, these widespread societal and environmental costs associated with chemical exposures, they felt or found exceeded about 10% of global GDP then, which was about $7.5 trillion. And that's set next to the total sector revenues of 4.4 trillion, so nearly double. UBS has calculated that the companies that are going to be impacted by PFAS regulation that's emerging, and that's just one class of chemical. So their total market cap is 30 trillion, because that's not just producers, but users. So again, a huge impact across many sectors and companies. We've already got mounting litigation in the US, particularly have paid out 11.5 billion in damages related to PFAS pollution, and there's many more cases coming. So that's also some of those payouts are very large in comparison to the market cap of some of those companies and their revenues. And there's predictions, or maybe not predictions, but some believe that these forever chemical lawsuits could ultimately eclipse the big tobacco settlement, which was in the end 200 billion. It looks like it's very much heading in that direction. So you can imagine, as a result of these enormous widespread impacts, that many UN agencies, national, regional governments are really starting to step up their efforts to adopt or strengthen or extend treaties and regulations to address them. And at the moment, there is this particular focus on PFAS that I'm sure Sonia will explain more. She's much more of a technical expert than I am. But one of those steps taken by regulators, well, not regulators, but the global sort of policy community recently was the finalization, after many, many years of negotiation, of something called the Global Framework on Chemicals, agreed in Bonn in September. And this was agreed through a multi-year, as you can see, very long, multi-stakeholder negotiating process. You have practically every UN agency involved in the overarching organization, the IOMC. And so now we have this global framework that sets out a roadmap to 2030 to try to address many of these impacts and risks. It is very much unified in terms of wanting to tackle emissions, nature loss, labor issues, human rights, health. So it's comprehensive and holistic. And within it, it has objectives and targets that are directed at the financial sector, including institutional investors. So we feel and hope that this should provide a basis to sort of galvanize institutional investors such as yourselves to begin to play a much more active role in delivering the goals of this framework. And of course, it's very important to mention that also there's a global plastics treaty, as you probably know, being negotiated currently, which addresses, that particular element of this agenda. So what can we do as institutional investors? You'll be familiar and no doubt use many of these levers already, working from left to right. So, of course, we can put in place portfolio exclusions through screens and using due diligence processes. We can integrate into our research and investment decisions considerations of these companies' portfolios and the hazardousness of their products. So, of course, a lot of those ESG ratings currently focus on more sort of the process and policy and management system side, but I would say it's very, very important to look at how hazardous the portfolios are. And that's where ChemSec comes in, because it provides great information about companies and the number of hazardous products they have in their portfolios, at least in the EU and the US, but also points out where there are huge gaps in knowledge because the companies are not transparent about that. Voting, we all have the ability, of course, to vote, to use our votes with chemical companies and set expectations for them on climate, nature, health, and other social expectations. There are some interesting opportunities coming through more for venture capital and private equity and impact investors in these new companies that are coming through with safe and sustainable alternatives. And there's something called a blueprint there that's been developed for safe and sustainable chemistry by the Chemical Footprint Project. Actually, it's not the Chemical Footprint Project. I need to change that name. But any of you interested in that, I can provide more information. Then, of course, engagement. So we can all engage with producers and users of chemicals. And the next slide, I'm going to go through in detail all those different initiatives that already exist that target the chemical sector. Then we can participate in multi-stakeholder initiatives like the process that just arrived at the Global Framework on Chemicals, for example, and other regional and national opportunities. And then we can use our voice as a key stakeholder with policymakers to try to argue for the regulation at national, regional level, rules supporting disclosure frameworks, that kind of thing. So Just to say that I hope we will all be thinking about how to use all of these different tools to move forwards. And then finally, in case you're not aware, there are many initiatives that already tackle these impacts of the chemical sector. So Climate Action 100+, you're probably familiar with, covers major chemical producers, and so the engagement opportunities there based on the net zero company benchmark. There is the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change that just last year launched the investor expectations of chemical companies transition to net zero, which is a very useful basis for engagement on decarbonisation as well in this sector. Nature Action 100, hopefully many of you have joined that, also launched late last year, and chemicals is one of the sectors among the 8 that are initially targeted. Currently supported by 190 investors with around 24 trillion in assets under management. If you're not a member of that, please join, and you can get involved with the chemical sector engagement to look at biodiversity impacts and loss. To focus in on, again, the decarbonisation agenda, that Share Action in the UK has a programme supporting investor engagement with about 14 of the major chemical producers, which is very active and effective. In the US, you have the Investor Environmental Health Network that works on a lot of different issues facing this sector and produces the Chemical Footprint Project, which focuses more on users of chemicals, so that more the consumer goods companies, and whether they've got policies and plans to phase out hazardous chemicals. I am on the steering committee now of the Investor Initiative of Hazardous Chemicals launched last year, in support of the work of ChemSec, using ChemScore as the basis for our engagement. And so we're engaging with a lot of investors to try to get commitments from chemical producers to reduce and move away from substances of very high concern and other hazardous chemicals, and as well as other things. So you're welcome to join that initiative and those investor groups. Dutch investors particularly have got involved in BBDO's plastics initiative, but it's open to all to tackle the plastics agenda. And then again in the US, there's something called Toxic Free Future, which is a retailer report card looking at those retailers' programs to move towards safer chemicals. So there's a lot of material out there and a lot of different initiatives that are well established and well supported. So I very much encourage you to get involved with those to take more action on this sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Sonia, I'll let you take the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very pleased that I'm here again after 10 years. I have been in Paris at one of your lunch meeting or breakfast meetings in 2014 with the topic of chemicals. My first question, do you see my screen now?
Yeah, we do, but it's still on Teams, so you should maybe...
What do you mean it's on Teams?
Do you see Rachel on your screen? No,
yes.
It's good. This is good now. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, this is the Teams is good. This is good. Great.
Great.
You can start.
Good. Thank you very much. So first of all, just to introduce you briefly to ChemSec. We are an environmental organization based in Sweden, and we have the focus only on chemicals. So chemicals is our topic, and we drive the political discussion. We are in a lot of European committees on the topic of implementation legislation, but also developing new ones. That is one pillar of the policy work. And then we are working with companies. We do have a business group where Apple, Adidas, Sony, IKEA, H&M, Lego. So there are a lot of companies in there which are striving towards a progressive chemical management, and we are their sparring partner, more or less, there. And to help companies, not only the big ones, but also smaller ones, we do have tools where you can identify chemicals for your products. We also have a marketplace sharing alternatives out there. So we really try to make it practical to move to a progressive chemical management. And last but not least, that's why I'm here, we inform investors. My background is I was an investment banker before. I was a proprietary trader in Munich and in London Stock Exchange. And so therefore I translate more or less the knowledge on chemicals into a language which is understood by investors. That's ChemSec in a nutshell. We heard already Rachel giving us the big picture of the pollution of chemicals and which problems we create with it. And now I would like to focus more on the details. And these are the PFAS, the group of persistent substances, which has been already mentioned a few times and maybe also known by you, because Le Monde was very much in the forefront of researching this piece of information of media outlet where pollution of PFAS are seen, and also this is, I understand that they are still updating it. So you can see the map here. I focused zoomed in onto France, where you see already some hotspots on these perfluorinated substances. But so therefore, in whole Europe, we see at the moment around 17,000 contaminated sites. We see in all our blood concentrations above the safe levels. As Rachel mentioned, we had some of the European politicians tested, but also in ChemSec we did the tests, and I think all of us except one, we have been all over the safe levels. So there are health effects attached to it, of course, cancer, reproductive problems, and we really have to bring these levels of PFAS down. So because they are omnipresent in food and water. We have overstepped the planetary boundaries, and the problem is the persistency, so that chemical stays there, it doesn't degrade, it stays there for thousands of years. So the problem increases with the time when we are still producing more and more PFAS. Yes, and we have done our own research where we have looked at the health effects, also at remediation costs, and we just made it into relation to what is earned by PFAS. Yeah, so the little dolphin up there with PFAS revenue of 26 billion, but this huge societal cost of 16 trillion. And that's why you see now globally that the legislation is picking up. And in Europe, we do have the PFAS restriction proposal, where we really would like to, where the policy would like to restrict most of the PFAS. I've also pasted the link. You will receive the slides afterwards, so you can see our methodology of calculating these costs. What we hear from industry very often as arguments that PFAS and other hazardous chemicals are needed is that there would be no green transition, that PFAS are in batteries and in solar panels and so on. And yes, that is true. But we calculated most of the PFAS can be replaced Around 8% we do think are still needed for society for a certain period till we develop the alternatives. But for most of them, for example, in heat pumps, you have the so-called F gases. There are alternatives available already for a decade, so it's possible. For your jacket, which is waterproofed, the textile industry has developed together with the chemical industry alternatives, so you don't need PFAS. You maybe see it when you buy a jacket, a rain jacket, or that it says PFAS free already on that. So there are many alternatives available. And such a restriction always has derogations for a certain time frame. So if companies tell you, well, this will kill our business completely and we will be out of business, that is not true. There will be derogations for to allow innovation in the due time. And in our eyes, there is no transition to be called green if it contributes to the PFAS crisis. And one other argument we hear often, that fluoropolymers and F gases are no PFAS or not that problematic, but that is not true. The whole fluorochemical compounds are at risk at the moment, or are posing risks, and there's the aim to regulate them. So I was asked to also introduce you to ChemScore. ChemScore is a ranking we developed. We do it now in the fifth year. This year will be the fifth year. And we rank the top 50 global chemical producers solely on their chemical management. So how sustainable is that? And our aim with this is that we do think investments should be done into the front runners and the best performers, and avoid the risk of hazardous production from the worst performers there. And also what we see is the chemical sector is very engaged. Out of these 50 companies, we are in contact with 36 on a continuous way. So they are very engaged. They see that as a benchmark and are aiming for more points every year. To run down how we do this evaluation, which we, by the way, we only do because we feel this is a lack in the ESG reporting nowadays. The chemicals are so important for so many sectors and in every single product. So, or 95% of the products, Rachel, you said that. So that it is really a very big topic, and that's why we thought we had to develop ChemScore. We look at the category 1, we look into the hazardous product portfolio. We do have data for Europe and for US. That is where we weighted most heavily with 18 points. We look into the innovation. Do we see safer products? And also management and transparency. Is it there? Do we get informations where the company is heading, what they are planning, what their strategy is, also for circularity, for example. And the last one, the lack of controversies, is for us a little bit of a control. If we do not get data for some of Asian companies, for example, where it's really difficult to get the hazardous product portfolio, we want to make sure that there are not litigations out there, or that we don't miss them. Because if you have hazardous portfolio, you run into problems. You have to have really good safety measures. In total, this is 48 points, and we only use public information, which is available so that you can also look at it if you want to. A little bit into the categories. As I said, we are looking at the most hazardous substances because they are financial risk. You have a regulatory risk. Yeah, the company, for example, for the PFAS, they really have to find alternatives. They have to produce different stuff. If you have to do it from half a year to the next, then it's really getting tough. So that is a risk. But also future litigations, we see that especially with PFAS, where we have litigations mounting now. And last year we have added even more PFAS focus. We've added more chemicals which are PFAS, and we added more companies with the dot. You see they were added last year because of their PFAS production. And you see here also the numbers of PFAS chemicals with most of them, and with Arkema still having 10 PFAS chemicals on the slide. In the category 2, we are looking at safer products. Do they do a hazard assessment of their products? And do we see cutoff criteria for new products? So if they do invent new products, what they do? Do they really plan or design out hazardous chemicals? And also, do they have bio-based and recycled feedstock? And our aim is to, with this category, to see if a company is fit for the future. In category 3, it's, as I said, corporate strategies. It's also, do they have circular policy in place, and also key performance indicators to understand if it's ambitious what they do in the circular strategy. So is the management ready to change? And of course, transparency is our key, because only then we can understand what the company is doing. And the last one, as I said, it's a control station for us to see if the company is following the regulation and obey to their own policies, and if they are really walking their talk and make safe products, processes, but also safe products for the consumers to use. And what does our evaluation end up? You can see here at this slide, it's a ChemScore year to year. So for all the years, the 4 years we have done ChemScore, you see all the companies. It's interesting that we do have 2 Asian ones in the front, Savage and Indorama, then followed by a lot of Europeans, and the Europeans are those ones here. So it's more in the upper part, but still, as you also see, there's no A or no green company yet there. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. But it's possible. If we look into the single details of the questions and the answers, if we would take out all the best ones, we would immediately be in the A. So companies are able to achieve that. And you wanted me to look at Arkema and compare it. Arkema is the only French company we do have in our ChemScore universe. And here you have that. It's in the middle of the European universe. And I would say that Solvay and BASF are probably the peers. Solvay is also producing fluoropolymers like Arkema, so that is probably very comparable. Solvay has a few better points because they are really working very hard on each of the points, except with the hazardous portfolio, they are not going down. We don't see that, but for the rest, for the questions and the strategies and so on, they are quite good. But looking more into Arkema, you probably know that their business, just briefly, they have advanced materials, so polymers and surfactants. Polymers are the basis for plastics, coatings, so resins and absorbents, adhesives, but also intermediates. We had made a report on the PFAS production, and Arkema is one of the 12 largest PFAS producers in the world. So we do see a big possibility, but also need for transformation of the company. And here is the Chem score for Arkema. You can find that on our website in more detail. Also improvement points we suggested. Generally, we see an upward move. They're coming from a low level of 9 points when we started in 2021 to evaluate them. Now we are at 17 points. So they do have an upward move. Nevertheless, the category 1, the hazardous portfolio, they get 0 points in all those years. And we have 15 persistent chemicals where PFAS is again a group inside these 15 persistent chemicals where we think there is urgent need for action on that one. As said, they have a good product assessment. It's based on World Business Council of Sustainable Development tools, which we think is good. They have bio-based and circular products. And also they do disclose revenue on their production on substances of very high concern. Very sorry for this abbreviation. So it's the most seriously hazardous substances. And they also show the number they produce globally, which is a transparency move beyond regulation, which we appreciate. Nevertheless, they do have litigations, and there will be more PFAS litigations as we see. We spoke yesterday that the Lyon case was turned down, but actually we really do see much more problems in this field coming up in the future. And I would close with this slide of the investor initiative on hazardous chemicals. Rachel already introduced you to that. Here you see already quite many of our investment companies that have joined to really engage with the companies. We are, I think, around 60 investment companies now, and again over 11 trillion. So it's a still growing group of very engaged investors where we are very grateful, because we do think the companies are really listening to you and are there to change things. So it is also in your hand to work more for safer products and better chemical management in the chemical industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you. It was really clear. So now we'll start with the questions. So there is you can raise your hand on Teams if you want to ask a question. There is a first one in the chat that I will read if you want. So it is from Charlotte Vess, who is saying, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. Regarding PFAS-related transparency, which best practice do you observe on this side within the sector? And which companies are among the most transparent ones? Which type of information is publicly disclosed?
Yes, who should answer it? Justine.
I think you can take that, Sonia, with the Braskem and other examples maybe. And
yes, exactly. Yeah, for transparency, actually, we really see that companies are now starting to step up. We do have Sabich, which really publish their whole product portfolio, including the volumes and the facilities. We do think that is really a best practice. Also, Braskem, the Brazil company, has it's called valuation book, where we still struggle a little bit because some of the chemicals are put into groups, and we really would like to see the single chemicals to understand it better. But it's already also quite a good move. It's a bit funny that those two companies are not in in one of these big trade organizations in Europe and US, but maybe this is that's why they are more transparent. That's just a guess of it. But I can post you links in there so that you can see that.
Maybe, Sonia, we should say, so that's one of the raison d'etre of ChemSchool, because we just do not have this transparency. We don't have this disclosure. So as investors, we have some information that ChemSec usefully pulls out of registers where companies have to disclose their production of certain products, but we don't have that information globally, so we can't tell how exposed to these different risks, particularly the regulatory and the litigation risk, the companies are. And so that's why it's one of the key asks of the investor initiative on hazardous chemicals, that the companies provide this breakdown on a regional or a country basis and on a substance by substance basis, because unless we have that, we are flying blind, as they say. We just don't know what our exposures are.
Thank you.
Exactly.
There is another question on the chat, which asks, could you please tell us about the real strength of chemicals lobbies on regulation?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is that during the times of REACH, there had been really studies out there how big the lobby efforts are from chemical industry. They still have huge offices in Brussels. So I'm mostly aware of the European lobbying. And the problem is that you can't really only look at these single companies, but they are represented in different associations. They do have different lobby groups. There is a interesting information from Conservatory on Environment, I think it's called. They have, for example, looked into BASF in detail on lobbying strategies, and it's amazing. And I can only say, because we are in committees, we are working with policymakers, but also with the implementation. And I have so often seen policy which is quite progressive in the beginning to start with, and then suddenly things are missing or dropping out, even if public consultation said differently. And there you only can assume that the lobbying of the chemical industry has found its its way into it. So so therefore I don't have an exact figure or so, but it's by far outweighs the possibility of lobbying of NGOs or others.
Yes, and I could add to that. So clearly for lobbying on climate change, we have Influence Map, and we have, for the Climate Action 100 plus companies in the chemical sector, which is only a handful of producers, they are rated by Influence Map on the extent of their lobbying on the climate agenda, which is great. But I would absolutely love, I've been saying it for a while, to have an Influence Map that captures the same lobbying on the hazardous chemicals agenda and regulation. If we had that kind of benchmarking, then it would give us the basis to engage with the chemicals companies on that agenda too. So yes, I keep suggesting it, and at some point, hopefully, somehow, a project will emerge. But at the moment, yes, we don't have nearly enough consistent information in the form of kind of a benchmark to be able to tackle it.
Thank you. Another question on the chat, so I'll read it. Any leading safer alternatives to hazardous chemicals? For instance, any commentary around implementing green polymers as an alternative to plastic or using bio-based feedstock?
Well, first I just put in the chat the BASF lobbying and also the Sabich chemicals business overview, where you can see that. So in terms of alternatives, yes, there are many companies out there innovating alternatives, especially to PFAS, because now the regulation is pending. It's from startups to the big ones. It's really on all the agenda of all the chemical companies, I would say. We are trying to also sort that a little bit to understand where, in which fields we do need more alternatives on PFAS, but this is happening. There was the question on a specific product. Was that, Justine, which I missed now? And you're muted. You're still muted.
It's in the chat. Yeah, it's to do with safer alternatives, particularly green polymers.
Green polymers. Yeah, so polymers, again, this is plastic, and yeah, there are plastics is such a huge variety of plastics you do have. It always depends what use do you use it for. And sometimes it's very easy. A PET bottle is just a PET, that's just one substance, and you can recycle it nicely. But then you have, for example, layers of plastic if you buy cheese or meat. Because then it needs to be safeguarded that there's no mold and so on and so forth. And there you have very often also perfluorinated polymers in there. So, but again, this is packaging and food contact material. For food contact materials, also there are alternatives available.
And maybe more generally, just use this opportunity to say, so probably for any of you who are more involved and or have teams that do venture capital or private equity, obviously a lot of the companies that are developing the safer or more sustainable alternatives tend to be startups or quite small. So there's an organization called ISC3, which I'll put in the chat, which actually does, I think it's called something different in France, but there's a TV program here called Dragon's Den, where entrepreneurs go up in front of angel investors, very wealthy people, and pitch their ideas and try and get funding. So ISC3 runs those kinds of events to try to match emerging companies with investors. And then the other thing was that blueprint I mentioned for safe and sustainable chemistry that's been developed by some specialist professor in the US, and that's also trying to lay out, and they do a lot of work trying to match investors with emerging companies. I'll try and find that blueprint and put it in the chat as well.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Please free to hold your hand if you want to speak. Yes, Verti, you can open your mic.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering, in terms of strategy for engagement, where do you see the biggest lever today to achieve the goals of eradicating hazardous chemical use? Is it really with the manufacturers of those products as investors, or is it more on the regulatory side? And if so, with which regulators in particular? Is it with clients of those manufacturers? So you mentioned the 30 trillion market cap that includes the entire value chain, if I understand correctly. So where is the biggest lever? And I'm glad we talked about lobbying also, because that was going to be one of my questions. But yeah, thank you.
Rachel, would you start?
Yes. So I think a balance between putting pressure on the producers for this transparency and to take the steps that ChemScore and IIHC ask for, which is to really get these commitments to phase out the substances of very high concern to start with, and then the other hazardous chemicals. But then if they're hearing that same message from obviously their customers and end users, that's very powerful. So why I'm slightly hesitating is the difficulty for us as investors. If you've got capacity to kind of go one by one through the users and the big consumer companies, for example, and to do sort of one by one engagement, great. At the moment, there isn't really a collaborative investor engagement that facilitates that process with the downstream, sort of user side of the sector, of the sector's products. So, it would be great to see that. Yes, there's the initiative on plastics, but in terms of speaking to the big retailers, the likes of, consumer good manufacturers, etc., we'd all have to tackle that one by one. And personally, I feel these days, it's more efficient and effective and impactful if we do that through a collaborative initiative. So, we have the collaborative initiatives to work through on the producer side through Climate Action 100+, the Share Action program, Nature Action, and IIHC, but we don't really have that on the user side. And when it comes to regulators, I think, yes, there's some that we can do, but it feels to me that is so enormously complex and technical. It's very, very difficult for investors to know what the right kind of entry points are. I think Sonia has a lot more insight into that than I do. I know occasionally you've offered us opportunities to meet with policymakers, but maybe you could pick up on that and see and say what you think the investor role could be.
Yeah, definitely. So I think engagement is a very good start to with the chemical producers. Again, also for the users, there is no data available. So not only there is no engagement initiative, but we lack the data. Who is using what? Nevertheless, the downstream users, especially if they are close to consumers, they also have a big reputation problem. So they are quite I would say rather more on the progressive side than others. Yes, the engagement on chemical companies. Nevertheless, I think the biggest impact is through legislation, because then you capture everyone and it's a level playing field. And we at ChemSec, we are working on the chemical legislation, and we had the chemical strategy. This was part of the Green Deal, and some of the things went through. So like we've seen now the restriction coming, it's not yet finalized on PFAS, and we saw some classification, which is really good. But we also lost. We lost the revision of REACH, for example. It's not clear if that will be taken up next in the next commission. And we see again a backlash if we have more I would say, conservative or right-wing commission. I still hope that we will get it. We will get a good one, but there in a chemical legislation, it would be fantastic to have a push also from investors. And the second pillar of legislation we are looking at is the sustainable finance legislation. And there are the reporting standards, which in my eyes are very progressive at the moment. We will see what the data which will come out in the first parts in 2025. But we will definitely have a lot more transparency then. This should not be weakened. It should be strengthened in time. There will be the development of the chemical sector specific reporting standards up to 2026. So that will be very interesting to see. And also for EU taxonomy, there are criteria pending, which I think are quite good, but they are not yet in a delegated act. So very technical, political discussions. But I would encourage every investor, if you are keen on digging into EU legislation, yes, there are possibilities, and this will create, you can turn the big screws, I always say, where you really then have everyone who has to comply with in Europe.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, I think there is no more questions. If it is the case, I will thank you very much again, Sonia and Rachel. It was really clear, and it is a really an important subject. So thank you very much for giving some time to talk to our members today.
Thank you very much for inviting.
Yeah, more than happy to. Thank you. Bye, everybody.